can be named. So that's one piece of the answer here, but there's also a specification that provides the means to run a root zone copy locally to any resolver anywhere on the internet. And you can do this because the domain name system security extensions allow you to be sure that you've got the right data. So the concern about where root servers are hosted seems to me to be more about politics than any real concern about risk that the operation of the internet might fragment. But there are other identifier systems that also some people think present risks. So the digital object architecture and the identifiers associated with it, which are called DOIs. There's also some kinds of new DNS-like replacements that are frequently built atop blockchain, and there's a lot of excitement about this among some people. To me, these are just sort of alternative identifier systems on the internet, no more different than Twitter handles instead of email addresses. There's nothing wrong with those. The other thing that's funny about this is because DNS names are so fundamental to what we do online, for something really to take over the place of the DNS, you'd have to upgrade every computer in the universe. And the only hope would be a system that would be incrementally deployable. And you'd have to use the existing DNS to do that, of course, because you'd have to build on top of it. This is actually the way DOIs work. If you want to resolve a DOI in practice, you start by resolving a DNS name. Now, the problem with incremental deployment of any sort is always that you have to keep compatibility with the old system. And so you need something really, really compelling to replace the old system if you want to get people to use the new features. And one of the problems that we have here is that the naming system works reasonably well, and so you need something super compelling in order to get people to go over to it. So what we see in case of DOIs, for instance, is that they're useful in some cases. Publications, for instance, find them useful, because they're a sort of globally unique numeric identifier. But we have globally unique numeric identifiers, and we invented the DNS so that we didn't have to remember IP addresses. So we're still going to need a naming architecture. The same issue is true of blockchain replacements for the DNS. The thing that's interesting there is that most of them seem to be trying to fix a problem that most people don't have. So they're very often an effort to avoid the consensus policies and associated fees from the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, or ICANN. And then they're supposed to work more or less like domain names that we already use. The problem with this is that the dispute resolution processors and efforts to protect strings that resemble trademarks that are part of ICANN's processes are actually features that got built because people were unhappy with first come, first serve approaches to domain names. So replacing all of those consensus policies and the associated fees with a new first come, first serve blockchain architecture might actually look like a step backwards. So the biggest threat of fragmentation in this context is that you might get two identifier systems and they use the same string. And then there's this potential for confusion because the two different identifier systems use the same name, but they don't resolve to the same place. This risk, of course, grows as ICANN expands the root zone. They've been adding more and more names to the root zone. But this kind of concern is actually as old as ICANN. And you still have the problem that you've got to convince everybody to upgrade their computer. And so that doesn't seem like a very serious fragmentation threat, at least right now. Now, one possible flaw with this analysis is that DNS over HTTPS is starting to emerge. This is often called DOE. The point of DNS over HTTPS is to encapsulate domain name system messages inside HTTPS. And one of the advantages of this is that you get encryption as a result of this. So there is this idea that once you had DOE widely distributed, you could maybe replace the resolution mechanism that sits underneath the HTTPS. So instead of DNS over HTTPS, you use some other resolution mechanism. But of course, in order for that to happen, you'd have to have DOE become ubiquitous in the first place, and it's far from that today. And then we'd have to design this new resolution system, and then we'd have to incorporate it in somehow. Now, that might serve as a vector for fragmentation, and I hear a lot of people concerned about this. I don't know if it really represents fragmentation, though. If your resolution mechanism is actually through DOE and then it uses more than one naming system underneath the hood, why do you care? What you get is a single resolution context in any case, and that is that might actually be a mechanism by which we could upgrade the DNS, which so far has been impossible to do. But this provides a mechanism by which you really could do that. What is probably a greater concern, however, is not actually DOE and how it might replace the domain name system, but rather the response that many people have started to make to DOE, which is to create specific mandatory DNS resolvers for users. Maybe they're DOE resolvers, maybe they're just plain old DNS, but it doesn't really matter. What they're requiring is that you use certain ones. And this is actually normally a blunt instrument to impose content filtering. It's not really about the DNS at all. We're seeing such cases, and we're seeing more of them. We're seeing the call for this start to grow, and it's partly in response to DOE, because DOE is obscuring the content of the DNS messages from system administrators and from network administrators, and they're unhappy about it. So what's interesting and illustrative here about this in particular is that the desire for control on the network is really what's driving the call for these specific resolvers, and it's not really to do with the technical fragmentation at all. Now, DNS names are not the only identifiers on the internet. Of course, the Internet Protocol, or IP, and its associated friends, the Transmission Control Protocol, or TCP, and User Datagram Protocol, UDP, these have all been coming under some fire. It's usually from a suite of proposed alternatives that are often called new IP. Now, the arguments against TCP IP mostly boil down to architectural ones. The internet model doesn't provide all the facilities of an ideal networking architecture. There's no presentation layer. Some argue that this is a fatal flaw. The architecture did not historically have security built in, which is why various routing security protocols and why encryption itself both had to be added later. So one side effect of the way things got built is that attribution of certain malicious acts online can be really hard to do, effectively impossible. You really can't tell all the time who is acting in a bad way. And then there's another issue, kind of on the side, which is that IP-based protocols are best efforts networks. And that means making timing guarantees for real-time protocols and so on is at least very, very hard. For certain applications, this is especially true in industrial control, but the one that is brought out most of the time is, Internet of Things and automotive interaction and so on, really needs real-time operation. So those are reasons to suggest that maybe a different protocol is needed. And the idea is, if we're going to go to the work of designing a new protocol, then we should take the opportunity to address all of the other issues we might have had with TCP or IP or both. Now, the very idea of replacing this basic protocol seems like it could contribute to fragmentation, but the fragmentation potential here is made worse by the way these efforts have been pursued. So those proposing new IP have not found a sympathetic audience within the Internet Engineering Task Force, and rather than abandoning the project, proponents took their efforts to the International Telecommunications Union. And this kind of venue shopping for standards potentially contributes to fragmentation because of the way the internet works. The basic functions of the internet depend on voluntary implementation of standard protocols. If there is competition among those standards to achieve the same functionality, there is a risk that two networks will be unable to interoperate because they will not both implement the same protocols. Alternatively, every network ends up having to implement both protocols for all use cases, and that increases everybody's costs. Now, the kind of technical fragmentation that I've been talking about is definitely concerning and is likely to have effects on ordinary users of the internet. But another line of fragmentation is much more aimed directly at consumers of internet services, and it flows through mandatory content blocking most of the time. These mandates are manifold. Some come from legislations, Others, such as the example on the screen here, come from courts, yet others come from the private actions of various service providers on the internet responding to regulations or legislation. So an example of this is geo-blocking by non-European sites to avoid liability under the European General Data Protection Regulation. All of these cases mean that different people on the internet have different and sometimes really radically different experiences available to them. And while there have always been people attempting to control the internet in various ways, it seems to me that there has been a shift in which fragmentation is now regarded as somehow desirable rather than a regrettable decision. The influences fragmenting the internet are what I call splinter engines, and there are many. I've placed a selection of splinter engines into two categories here, the sort of strict legal requirements on the one side that blocks actual connectivity, and then various other mandatory controls that nevertheless have the effect of fragmenting the internet. So obviously, if you try to block connectivity using a national firewall or sovereign internet movement, that's a fragmentation. I like to think of these as nation online because of their resemblance to the old early America online service. It provided a curated gateway to the internet. It didn't actually provide you full internet access in its original incarnation. And that's what these nation online systems do as well. And all of these connectivity controls that I've listed here can be found in the wild today. But the other category, the mandatory controls, which are usually intended to operate on content, turn out to be splinter engines as well. The goal is usually pretty narrowly tailored, but because the internet is fundamentally a general purpose technology, rules attempting to control content in one context or to evaluate age or other such things turn out to create legal and business risks for firms providing internet services. And that leads them, to put various kinds of filters in place, which leads to splintering, even if that wasn't the goal of the regulation or legislation. And that's pretty clearly how the GDPR has contributed to fragmentation, for example. There's a beautiful paper by Bill Drake and Vince Cerf and Kleinwachter that is linked there if you like to have a look at a more exhaustive set of these. The two categories that I listed aren't the only ones. I'm sure other analyses would provide different kinds of categorizations, but there is something that holds these all together, and it's this. The engines undermine the critical properties of the internet and the conditions that enable the internet to thrive. Before I turn to what those properties and enablers are, I just thought I'd touch on the question of why these are back again. Many of us who've been around for a number of years recognize many of these discussions as like painfully familiar. And so the question is, what's new? And I guess part of the pressure is obviously the internet is ubiquitous. When these debates happened the first time, the internet was just a burgeoning technology. It wasn't part of everybody's daily life. And some of it, of course, comes from the rise of social media systems and the way that those have interacted with the world. We got to admit that there are definitely problems that arise from the ubiquity of the internet. The fact that the internet is available everywhere, or mostly everywhere. Of course, we've still got lots of people who are disconnected. It does affect us in various dramatic ways. Nevertheless, there is something about the way policy is made in many jurisdictions that affects us. Many of the people in the internet community concluded that the fights the last time were over and that we could turn to new issues. But young people who are often a critical part of the legislation and regulation development process, they didn't experience those debates. They weren't around, and they've often never lived without the internet. So it may be a case that the internet has been a victim of its own success. The internet presents a single, simple interface to a vast array of complicated and interdependent services. They're operated without any central control. But because of the very success of the internet's apparent unity, it looks like it's a centralized system, and so it looks like an ideal locus for regulation. And the challenge for those of us who love the internet is to reintroduce the nature of the internet back into this important public conversation. So what is that nature? The Internet Society has an idea that there are certain critical properties without which the internet doesn't exist. These are necessary conditions, and if they are eroded, we will lose the internet irrevocably. We might have something we call the internet, but it will not be the sort of technology that has presented so many opportunities to so many. So these critical factors are these ones here. An accessible infrastructure with a common protocol, an open architecture of reusable and interoperable building blocks, decentralized management and a single distributed routing system, common global identifiers, a technology-neutral general-purpose network. These are the basic internet basics of the internet way of networking. There are lots of ways to build networks. This is the internet way. If we want something that we call the internet with a capital I, then these necessary conditions just have to be part of the constituent networks. We discussed this idea in deeper detail on the link on this slide. But it's not enough. The critical properties are not enough on their own. You could build networks that met all of these, but that would still not be open, globally connected, secure, or trustworthy. So there are several factors that are important enablers to give us the internet we want. We need easy and unrestricted access, unrestricted use and deployment of internet technologies, unrestricted reachability, available capacity, data confidentiality of information, devices, and applications, integrity of information, applications, and services, reliability, resiliency, and availability, accountability, and privacy. These factors can sometimes be available to a greater or lesser extent in any given internet context, and the loss of any one of them might not be fatal to the internet, but if they are all weak, then the internet is in trouble. We talk about this more at the link there on the slide. Now, in this context, it's really easy to see how various splinter engines start to chip away at the critical factors or erode the enablers of the internet. For instance, shutdowns attack both the accessible infrastructure and the decentralized management of the internet. Interference in the operation of the DNS attacks the system of common global identifiers. Mandatory filters on content, as well as consequential filters that come as a side effect of regulations. They erode the general purpose nature of the network and impinge on easy and unrestricted access, as well as the ability of people to deploy new internet technologies. I'm not going to belabor this, but the point is you can do the same analysis for every one of the splinter engines that I've mentioned, and even the ones that I haven't. This analytic framework is what led the Internet Society to create the Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit. And the impact assessments don't actually have to be especially complicated, so I'm going to try to walk through a cartoon version of one right now so you can see how it works. Nope, wrong way. There we go. So imagine this, this case. This is an attempt to analyze the idea of nation online. Let us assume that some countries make it an explicit goal to be locally sovereign. In network terms, we can see this idea illustrated here, 3 totally different isolated networks. The isolation is a technical matter. Anything in network A is A's responsibility, similarly with B, and so on. And this tight control seems like the sort of thing that people want to do with Nation Online. But of course, that's not exactly what is desired. For there are bound to be resources in network A that people in network B want to consume. After all, that's what causes us to build networks in the first place. And so inevitably, we will have to invent new ways to connect together these disparate networks. Gradually, we will connect the separate networks together, allowing access to resources from one network when they are found in another. Now, this raises the obvious question as to why we would go the long way around. For what this really means is that we would have to reinvent the internet, the very thing we would have labored to disconnect. It would be at least wasteful. There's also no reason to suppose we'll do a better job the second time, and so it would be better for us to invest in making the internet we have better, instead of tearing it down only to seek to rebuild it. Already deployed, running code is valuable because it works. Setting ourselves up to break everything only to need to rebuild it would be one of the worst things we could do. Now, there are good reasons why the internet has expanded so widely and displaced so many other networking technologies. Networks, perhaps by their nature, want to connect. And because the value of a network increases in some relationship to the number of nodes attached to it, there is always some reason to connect networks together. But this does not mean that every node on every network needs to be connected or even connectable to every other node. There's no reason to put my printer on the public internet. And this has always been the case. There have always been nodes that try to control the connections to themselves, and there's nothing wrong with firewalls. So this is one of the problems that we have, and it's partly because we're adopting this binary thinking. We talk about fragmentation as though it's a state. Is the internet fragmented yet? But that's not the way to think of this. Every day I lose more hair, but asking the question, did I go bald yesterday, is silly. Similarly, the fragmentation of the internet is a kind of trend. Are we in general undermining the critical properties of the internet? Are we undermining the enablers, or are we keeping them in good shape? Too often, we aren't even doing the necessary analysis of policies to understand what they might do to this shared inheritance. We need to make informed choices because this is an urgent matter of public policy. And so we have to turn to our future. When we're making such informed choices, we need to accept a basic truth. Large systems, even ones we have invented, are not things we can change just however we want. Once we have made something, that creates facts, and it starts to work on us too. In this respect, it is interesting to think of another world-changing technology, the automobile. This is a photograph of children from the early 1920s. Notice that they're standing in the roadway, not on the sidewalk. At the dawn of the automotive age, the street was public space. Many different kinds of people expected to be able to use it. The reality of high-powered machines that are much more massive than the human body and that travel at much higher speeds gradually meant that people had to learn to use the sidewalk and to cross at traffic lights. There were all manner of tussles about this right outcome of this, but in the end, a new technology remade our physical world. It is important to note that this tussle never ended. It isn't like we said, right, sidewalks and traffic lights, and now everything's fine. We continue to struggle to keep pedestrians safe for motorists. Some cities are much better at this than others, but it starts with the acceptance that cars are a fact in the world and that we must cope with that. We made choices, and some of them were unwise, by including a large array of interests. Pedestrians, drivers, automobile manufacturers, business people, urban reformers, engineers, policy experts, people with nostalgia for a disappearing age. All those people were involved in this always contingent reality of the way people and cars interact. We need to take the same approach with the internet. Simplistic reaction to how our society is changing in the face of the internet will not help us. Now, there are important differences between the social conditions in the case of the internet and the case of the automobile. Interestingly, some of the industrial players in the internet age seem not to want to make the internet better, but rather to create private walled gardens that are just for them and their users or customers. In that sense, the corporate stance at the dawn of the automobile age was perhaps more public-spirited than contemporary ones, even if it was driven by the same desire for profit. When you hear calls by large tech corporations these days to be regulated, one way to understand that is as an effort to protect a market in which they are overwhelmingly favored incumbents. And I think that this is an important consideration in our discussion about this. This all means that those of us who are interested in the internet, whatever our interest, need to engage genuinely with the current public discussions that tend to act as splinter engines. We need to acknowledge and understand the way the internet is affecting our societies and understand the extent to which some of these effects cannot be avoided. But we also need to press against proposals that blame the internet for weak public institutions, social division that comes from stagnant real wages and other social upheaval, or existing economic interests that have simply refused to adapt to the fact of the internet. And we must not despair of the internet, but remind everyone at every opportunity how many enormous benefits we derive from this marvelous technology. The very thing we are doing right now in this Zoom call was simply science fiction when I was growing up. For every case of poisonous online conversation, we must remind ourselves that the internet provided an amazing lifeline during a worldwide health emergency. That does not mean we should stand pat, and it does not mean that only the technocrats should be in charge. But it does mean that what we have now is not the only way the relationship between the internet and society can be, and we need to contribute to making that relationship better. Mostly, though, more than anything, we need to work to make sure that the internet, the one true network of networks that can permit all humanity to connect to one another, that it's for everyone. Thank you very much for taking the time today. I hope we have a nice conversation, and I'll stop sharing the screen now so we can see one another.
That was great, and I will turn over to Joe Rosell, who will manage the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Eric, and thanks for that very interesting talk, Andrew. I think it's very, very provocative. So I think we'll have quite a number of questions here. Maybe to just get us started at with one, I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the role of government policy in contending with some of the issues that you've that you've raised today. I mean, maybe some folks view government policy as being like the main lever or the main tool that can be used to address some of these issues, and other folks perhaps see government policy as less effective in this space. So I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit about government policy.
Well, I mean, there's no question that that government policy is going to have some consequences for the internet, and there's also no question that if we want to have a network that is at the service of the society, that the society is going to have some effects on that. I think the questions, the dual questions that we have to address, though, are partly having to do with the understanding of policymakers and legislators of the way the internet actually works. That appears to be one of the problems that we have, and I sort of referred to this during the talk, that there's this problem that the internet looks like a single thing, and so it's very easy to talk about it as though it's like a count now, where you could pick it up and move it 10 centimeters to the left and put it down again. But that's not how the internet works, right? It's much more like a thing like traffic on the roads, where you can't, like, if you divide the traffic into two, what you still have is traffic. You don't have two traffics. And the same thing is true of the internet. You can't really break it apart in that way and still have the internet at the end of it. What you have are different networks. Maybe you're going to call it the internet because that's just what people refer to online as now. But that's not the same thing as having the internet that provides this kind of opportunity that the internet really does. And I think that's the risk for us. Those of us who are really interested in the internet, we want to make sure that those policy discussions are happening with the appropriate level of information about what the consequences of policy options are.
Great. Thanks for that, Andrew. And I encourage everyone to please type your questions into the Q&A. Okay, so here's a question. So this is referring to one of your slides, on new IP. Do you think that the new ITU leadership will have a positive effect on rebutting the efforts to introduce new IP?
It's possible. It's hard to know. The way the ITU works is an interesting one, because it's an intergovernmental organization, right? It's a treaty organization, and so only governments have power there, and the leadership of the ITU is not, they're not dictators. They don't get to sort of set the agenda, but they do get to shape it and so on. So I mean, I think it's possible that this will have an effect on that debate. I also think it's possible that that it will change the relationship more generally. The United States historically has not been super warm to the ITU, but when somebody who came from the United States is the Secretary General of the International Telecommunications Union, that might change the United States' stance on that. And so there's a lot of unknowns in how this might play out. The deeper problem, from my point of view, is really an architectural one, which is that new IP is an attempt to, boil several oceans at one time. And the history of networking suggests that maybe that's not the best way to go at the problem, which is, I think, why this effort received a fairly chilly response in the Internet Engineering Task Force in the first place.
Great. Thanks. And that question was from Georg Serenci. This question comes from James Pake. What can we do as advocates to address the challenges on the splinternet? Can digital authoritarianism be part of the subset of challenges for the splinternet or internet fragmentation?
Yeah. So one thing I'm gonna be grouchy about terminology here for a moment, because I get really nervous about the idea of the splinternet, because like it's easy to fall back and forth between that, right? You think of the internet, and already you've got that implicit idea of it being one thing, and then we talk about the splinternet as though there's only one. The alternative to the internet is not the splinternet, but actually splinternets. Lots of different networks, or really just no internet anymore. And I think we need to be clear about that. Yes, authoritarianism is definitely one of the drivers of this, right? We can be confident because we can see in authoritarian regimes, but we can also see in authoritarian acts even outside of authoritarian regimes that that this kind of splintering is one of the tools that people reach for. So it isn't, this isn't exclusively, the Great Firewall or the Russian sovereign network. But also, of course, an American president ordered that no American networks were supposed to connect directly to China. And so that's a thing that happened. And we have, we have this history that happens over and over again. I think the critical piece here is to try to tackle this from its own, from the goals of the people who are trying to search for an answer. So you try to understand the challenges that somebody's trying to address, and then tackle it in an internet-like way, rather than pretending that this is like really just a giant corporate land that you're going to impose policies on, because it just doesn't work that way. And the kinds of policies that work in a sort of super local way that's kind of intuitive to you, like what do you do on your home network, they don't work at a global scale, and you actually need to have a different kind of conversation. And I think people who are involved in the telecommunications industry, people who are involved in networking more generally, have insights into that really need to be brought to bear in this public discussion.
Thanks, Andrew. So the next question here is, do you think that incentivizing user empowering tech can help? And in this case, such technologies allow users stronger control of what data and information flow from their machines.
Yeah, I think that this is actually a super important thing for us to do. I'm sort of a blockchain skeptic, I got to admit, but I will say that the discussions around Web3 still give me a positive hope, because they recognize that fundamentally the original web architecture is much more centralizing than the internet architecture more generally, because the web architecture sort of depends on the HTTP server, and you got to talk to it. And what that means is that server is under control, and then if you build certain social services on top of that, and it's all built on HTTP, then it increases the centralization in the system. And so the basic insight under a lot of this Web3 effort is to say, well, actually, we want to decentralize more of those services. And I think that really returns us to the vision of the internet as a collection of federated things that are all using common protocols and interacting that way. So I'm hopeful. I'm worried that it doesn't always have the rigor, because sometimes people are like trying to make sure that blockchain is involved, and that's sort of a distraction. What you really want is that distributed model as being the central thing.
Great, thank you. The next question is, who are the main actors that regulate the internet? Are we talking about the ITU, open source groups, states themselves? And against that backdrop, what do you think the possibility is there of potentially maybe sanctions from the UN Security Council or something like that being invoked around the internet?
Sanctions have definitely already been invoked, although not necessarily from the Security Council. But like an excellent example of this was early in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where a number of sanctions were imposed against Russia, Russian nationals, and various networks that they were operating. And the irony here, of course, is that people miss the issue with sanctions, which is that the people who can go around the sanctions are the ones that you're trying to attack, and the people who can't go around the sanctions are inevitably the ordinary citizens of the country that you're trying to close off. And those ordinary citizens are really your best hope to do something, to achieve the political goal that you have. Now, as a professional matter, I don't have an opinion on what those goals ought to be. But I think just as a technical analysis, it's obvious to me that the people who don't have backup networks are mostly ordinary folks. And the people who have backup networks and VPNs into other means to get them out of their sanctioned network, they're the powerful ones who already control the political entity that you're trying to sanction. And so this seems to me actually to be an ironic use of sanctions, where the only people who get punished are the people that can't do anything about the problem you're trying to solve. And that, I think, is rather unfortunate. As for who regulates, I mean, a lot of different people regulate a lot of these different things. And that's part of the reason this is such a complicated discussion, because the internet is made up of all of these constituent networks, and every one of those network operators is in some legal jurisdiction at any given moment. And so they're subject to local regulations and national regulations. They're also subject to their own business concerns. And then, there are the transnational things. And of course, the ITU is involved because it's a treaty agency. So there are many different places in which this regulation can be effective. And that's part of why the splintering is such a serious risk.
Great. Thanks. So to the next question here. So you noted that many policymakers don't understand totally what the internet is. So what are some ways to help educate policymakers about the nature of the internet? And do you see any particular challenges in doing so?
Well, one challenge is to convince them that they don't know something. So, that isn't to be. I'm not trying to be condescending there. I mean, the plain fact of the matter is, this is a weird technical infrastructure, and it's very, very familiar to a lot of people because it's like right in the middle of their daily life. So, your intuitions are powerful, just as any humans are. And so you feel like there's something obvious here, like you ought to be able to do this. And it's hard to put yourself into the position that, oh, I don't really understand this and I've got to get over it. The Internet Society does do a lot of work trying to inform policymakers and legislators and so on of the nature of the internet and things that are and are not possible. We're a tiny organization given our scope of operation. So, any joining of the Internet Society or, contributions to our finances are always welcome, but also other people doing the same kind of work is also welcome, because we want to collaborate with anybody who can help us advance this vision that the internet is for everyone. So, I mean, yeah, it's a challenge, but, I find that a lot of people who are working in this space in public policy are deeply interested, and they really do want to make good regulations, but you've got to get them first to the point where they understand what their regulations might do.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Is there something that policymakers or others consistently or routinely misunderstand about the internet?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. One is that it's not a smooth system. And so there is this idea that you can just make a regulation and apply it to the internet. And there are all kinds of parts of the internet that people just haven't thought about. A lot of the regulations are actually attempts to fix particular systems, right? So they're really attempts to fix large social media company systems and the effects of their influence. And so the regulations are written really to, fix pick your top 6 to 10 sort of cases. And then everything else is in the tail. But the problem is all of those things in the tail are the only hope that we have to displace the power of these large centralized things that the governments are frequently responding to. So I think that this is one of the clear examples where there's this idea, oh well, we're just gonna work on these top 10 or whatever, but they're having all kinds of nasty consequences for people who are maybe further down the level of consideration. I think that's the leading one, at least right now. If you ask me next week, I might have a different leading contender.
Okay, that's a great response. I'm wondering then, sort of, what is what's the relationship between Facebook or social media content regulation overall and internet fragmentation?
Just to pick up on what I was just saying, it's literally part of the problem, right? That people are attempting to write regulations, and they're writing them in such a way that they really capture very, very easily what happens with, Facebook or Twitter or wherever you like. But the problem is, if you're somebody so to pick an obvious example, there are very clearly regulations that people are trying to design around response to speech that is considered unacceptable, and to make the service liable for that. And so people started abandoning Twitter because, for unrelated reasons recently, and moving to this system called Mastodon. But Mastodon is a distributed system where many of the servers are run by volunteers in their spare time, like in their basements. And that is not an environment in which it's even obvious exactly who is responsible for this system, because Mastodon isn't one thing. It's a set of distributed systems. And that is just contrary to the intuition of the user experience, which is that you get this one experience of it. And so the tension way deep inside these regulation efforts is that they don't understand the fundamentals of this thing and have a model which is really designed for a centralized system of very large incumbents. And once you start regulating that way, then you write all the regulations so that that's the kind of thing that happens. And pretty soon you can't get out of the world where those large incumbents are the fundamental thing that the internet is built around. So it's the very thing that you were trying to solve that you end up cementing permanently in place. And that, I think, is a tragedy.
Thank you for that. That's a great response. So a question here is, then what do you think about the role of overarching global regulation? So you touched in your presentation that there are countries trying to comply with GDPR, and there are others out there. So do you think this could set the standard for international data flows and keep the internet integrated, or could it be another driver of further splintering?
Well, I guess there are two questions that we have to answer in order to know what the answer to this is. On the one hand, any kind of thing that says, well, this is how you have to do it, could result in a kind of splintering because it's a voluntary system, right? So if somebody doesn't come along, then they're going to go off and do things their own way, and now you've got a problem of how these things can interoperate. So that's where the danger of splintering is. But of course, that's actually how the internet always evolves, right? That somebody comes up with a new protocol, they produce it for other people, and if it works well, then people start picking it up and they use it over and over again. So the critical part of those kinds of international efforts really needs to be, along the voluntary standards model that the internet has been built along. Because if you get the people who have to implement it on board early enough, then they all just start implementing it, and then very quickly you get a positive cycle of deployment, which causes more demand, which causes more deployment, and so on. So it's really a question of what model we're going to use to try to get people to implement this stuff. And if we're going to try to do it by force, that is by saying, you must implement this thing, and if the system is sufficiently bad, then whenever people don't have to use it, they'll use something else, and that will not drive adoption. So that's really where we want to focus on the open standards development model, because that's how we get wide deployment.
Great, thanks. So from your perspective, what role is Canada playing here, or what role can Canadian regulators play in this space?
Well, I wish I had more optimism about this. The current legislation that the government has been bringing forward recently doesn't make me feel good about the future of the internet in Canada. I say that as somebody talking to you from Toronto. I live here. It is a situation where the adoption of the regulations looks like an attempt to try to create a kind of Canadian internet with a gateway to the rest of the world, and to allow the CRTC to make the decisions about like what is and isn't an acceptable business on the internet. So this is an example actually of where regulations are really driving towards and cementing the advantages of the current incumbents. Particularly in the case of money transfers, what this effectively will do is create an economy in which everybody becomes dependent on the existing, sort of large-scale concentrated services, because that's what's keeping everything else afloat. And in that sense, it's what I think of as the cigarette tax of the internet, right? For years and years and years, tobacco taxes were like something that no government could afford to cut, and no government could afford to raise too high because they didn't want to depress smoking rates, because they needed the revenue that the very, very expensive cigarette taxes brought in. And I think that this there's this potential for us to create a regime in Canada that looks like that.
Thanks for that, Andrew. A question here. Could you please elaborate on how internet impact assessments could be done? And is there a methodology, and who would carry them out?
Yes, so we have a whole page on the Internet Society site on how you can carry out an internet impact assessment. We have a template for how to do it, and how to identify it and so on. And we have staff who are happy to respond to questions that you have and so on. If you just go to internetsociety.org and look for Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit, You will find the links that you need. And if you don't find the links that you need, then email me and I will get them to you, because we are very keen for other people to undertake these as well. We have had considerable success, and not only ones written by our staff, in influencing regulatory efforts, particularly early in some of these cases, because we've been able to show to people, look, you're going to have this effect, but if you did this thing instead, it would be more like it would contribute better to the internet. And we've got a small staff. We can't do them for every bad idea that's on the internet, because they seem to be reproducing faster than I am.
Just a quick follow-up on that. If someone was to use that tool, would differences in values that drive current pressure towards fragmentation result in endless disagreements over impacts and consequences?
So what we try to do with this toolkit is to really take the internet's position. This is what it's going to do to the internet. Now, I mean, we're not a nation state. We can't tell nation states you're not allowed to do this. All we can do is tell them, if you do this, you're going to have this consequence for the internet. Maybe they'll say that's a good thing. I mean, China's been saying that is a good thing for ages. Russia's been saying that for more than a decade. They're like, yeah, we want to disconnect from the internet. Okay, I can't help you. In that case, what I can do is tell you this is what's going to happen, and then you say, well, I want that to happen. All right, that's your choice. I think it's unfortunate. I think you're doing damage to your own interests. I think the internet is a resource for everyone. But if you want to do that, at least you're doing it with the appropriate information.
That's great. So this is a fun counterfactual potentially. So if the internet were to bifurcate into a US-EU internet and a Chinese-Russian one, what do you think would make reunification possible, and how could the Internet Society contribute in such a situation?
Well, I mean, if the reunification were ever to happen, I mean, if this kind of actual splintering were to happen, where it really was a hard disconnect, then I guess what we would have to say is, well, that's unfortunate, but we've seen that in other social circumstances, right? I mean, the history of most of the 20th century involved, a fairly significant division between some societies and other ones. And, free open borders were not there and so on. And so I think, I think it's obvious that the social conditions are what need to change under those circumstances. You need ultimately a society that really does want to be connected to the rest of the world. So all we can do is offer the advantages of the internet and the opportunities, and to be able to, make those kinds of connections. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the technology is not really where the problem is there. It's really a policy question. And it's something that, the political leaders of those countries have to make some choices about. And naturally, it means that the population needs to make some choices as well. And it's very difficult, for the Internet Society to have an opinion about, what people should pursue in their national politics. That's not really our area of expertise.
Great. Okay, thanks for that, Andrew. So we're basically at time here. So that's all the questions there. I think that was a very dynamic Q&A. So thanks for taking on all those questions, Andrew. This has been a real fascinating discussion and topic. So thanks very much for that. I'll just pass it over to Stephen or Eric if they have any last words for the groups. But thanks very much, Andrew.
Thank you.
Well, from my perspective, just huge thanks, Andrew. That was great. In particular, the Q&A was very dynamic and engaging.
Yes, my thanks as well. Great session. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Recording